Picture this: a castle stands silent, its gates wide open, its halls empty, no signs of struggle, no traces of battle, just an eerie stillness where a powerful noble family once thrived. Overnight, they're gone, as if plucked from history itself. How does an entire dynasty vanish without a single sword drawn, without a single shout of rebellion? This isn't the plot of a mystery novel. It's the real, unsettling fate of 25 noble families from medieval Europe, whose disappearances remain some of history's most haunting puzzles. From the shadowy corridors of royal courts to the whispered rumors in peasant villages, these families didn't just fade away, they vanished, leaving behind wealth, land, and legacies that crumbled into dust. Some were victims of political machinations so cunning, their downfall was invisible until it was too late. Others seemed to simply step off the stage of history, their names erased from records, their castles abandoned to time. What forces could silence an entire bloodline overnight? Was it treachery from within, a king's silent wrath, or something even more mysterious? These aren't just forgotten footnotes, they're stories that tug at our curiosity, inviting us to unravel the threads of power, fear, and ambition that shaped the medieval world. Each disappearance is a locked door, and behind it lies a tale of intrigue, betrayal, or perhaps even escape. As we journey through these enigmatic vanishings, you'll discover how quickly fortune could turn in an era where loyalty was fleeting and power was everything. So settle in, because by the end, you'll see history not as a dry list of dates, but as a living, breathing mystery, waiting for someone like you to listen closely to its whispers. The House of Lusignan wasn't just another noble family, they were kings. For centuries, they ruled Cyprus and Jerusalem with all the pomp and power you'd expect from medieval royalty. But by the 1500s, their name had vanished from history as if wiped clean by an unseen hand. No invading armies stormed their castles, no rival dynasties declared war. Instead, their end came in whispers: a string of unexplained deaths, sudden disappearances, and a throne left eerily empty. Take King James III of Cyprus, the last Lusignan monarch. His reign should have been a time of triumph, but instead it became a cautionary tale. Officially, he died young from illness, yet court records from the time hint at something far darker. Guests at his final banquet reported strange symptoms: violent pains, sudden weakness, symptoms that sound suspiciously like poison, and he wasn't the only one. Over a few short years, nearly every direct heir met similarly untimely ends. Was this the work of a rival family, silently eliminating competition, or something even more sinister? Then there's the mystery of Charlotte, James's sister and heir. After her brother's death, she should have taken the throne. Instead, she fled Cyprus under cover of night, vanishing into Europe's shadowy courts. Some say she was running for her life, fearing the same fate as her family. Others whisper she was pushed out by scheming nobles who wanted the Lusignan legacy erased. Whatever the truth, her disappearance marked the final chapter for this once great house. Today, their castles still dot the Mediterranean coast, silent witnesses to a dynasty that simply evaporated. Walk the halls of Kyrenia Castle in Cyprus, and you can almost hear the ghosts of the Lusignans. The tapestries that once bore their crest have faded. The thrones they sat on gathered dust. It's as if history itself forgot them. So what really happened? Poison seems plausible given the era's cutthroat politics. But why leave no trace, no accusers, no triumphant rivals boasting of their victory? maybe the Lusignans saw the tide turning, shifting alliances, rising enemies, and chose to disappear before they could be destroyed. Or perhaps the truth is buried deeper, lost in the unread pages of some forgotten chronicle. One thing's certain, their story isn't just about a family's fall. It's a reminder of how fragile power could be, even for those who seemed untouchable. The declared dynasty didn't just fade, it collapsed like a castle built on sand. One moment, they were among England's most formidable nobles, controlling vast swaths of land and commanding armies. The next, their male line was snuffed out in a single generation, leaving no heirs to carry their name. No war horses charged, no siege engines battered their walls. Instead, their downfall came through a cruel twist of fate and the quiet machinations of royal politics. Take Gilbert de Clare, the last male heir. By all accounts, he was a man of power, Earl of Gloucester, a key player in the turbulent reign of Edward II. But his death at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a dynastic catastrophe. He left behind 3 sisters, but in medieval England, noble titles and lands rarely passed smoothly to women. What should have been a seamless transition became a feeding frenzy. King Edward II, always eager to consolidate power, swooped in, declaring the de Clare estates forfeit to the crown. Just like that, centuries of accumulated wealth and influence were dissolved into royal coffers. Then there's the eerie coincidence of timing. Gilbert's sisters, Elena, Margaret, and Elizabeth, were all married off to powerful men, but none produced sons to revive the de Clare name. Elena's husband, Hugh Despenser, became notorious as Edward II's favorite, a role that earned him more enemies than allies. When Edward's reign crumbled, Hugh was executed, and Elena's claims to the de Clare inheritance were stripped away. Margaret's line, too, faded into obscurity, and Elizabeth, her descendants would eventually rise again under different names, but the de Clare legacy was already dust. What makes their disappearance so unsettling is how ordinary it seemed. No grand conspiracy, no dramatic betrayal, just a series of personal misfortunes that snowballed into extinction. Their castles, like Caerphilly in Wales, still stand as monuments to their vanished power. Walk through their halls and you'll find no plaques honoring the de Clares, no banners bearing their red and gold. Their ghosts in their own homes. Was it bad luck or something more calculated? Some historians suspect Edward II saw an opportunity and pressed his advantage, ensuring the de Clare's wealth stayed in royal hands. Others point to the ruthless marriage politics of the era, where noble daughters were pawns in a game that rarely favored their families. Whatever the truth, their story is a stark reminder. In medieval Europe, even the mightiest dynasties were just one generation away from oblivion. The House of Blois should have been untouchable. At their peak, they weren't just nobles, they were kings, counts, and power brokers whose influence stretched from the Loire Valley to the throne of England. Thibaut the Great, their most famous patriarch, once held sway over vast territories, and his descendants even married into royal blood. Yet by the 1300s, their name had slipped from history's pages as quietly as a candle snuffed out. No armies came for them, no rebellions tore down their castles. Instead, their disappearance was a masterclass in how dynasties could unravel stitch by stitch, without a single drop of blood spilled. Take Count Henry of Champagne, one of the family's brightest stars. Through marriage, he became ruler of Jerusalem during the Crusades, a glittering achievement that should have secured his lineage for generations. But fate had other plans. When Henry died suddenly in 1197, rumors swirled. Some chroniclers whispered of a fall from a palace window, while others hinted at poisoning. Whatever the truth, his death left no surviving sons, only a daughter whose inheritance was swiftly absorbed by her husband's family. It was a pattern that would repeat, brilliant marriages that brought short-term glory but long-term erosion. Then there's the curious case of the Blois Champagne branch. For decades, they seemed invincible, counting queens and crusaders among their ranks, but each generation saw their lands splintered further. Daughters inherited, but their husbands' names took precedence. Sons were scarce, and those who survived often died young, their titles scattering like leaves in the wind. By 1234, the last male heir, Thibaut V, was gone, leaving no one to carry the torch. What's haunting is how little resistance there was. Their castles, like the imposing Château de Blois, still stand proudly over the French countryside, but step inside, and you'll find no traces of the family's once fervent ambitions. The tapestries depict other dynasties, the chronicles barely mention them. It's as if they willingly stepped aside, their legacy dissolving into the marriages they'd so carefully arranged. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the Blois. In an era where bloodlines meant everything, they played the game too well, marrying into greatness, only to vanish into the very alliances they'd crafted. No villain orchestrated their end, no catastrophe sealed their fate. They simply dissolved, proving that sometimes the quietest exits are the most permanent. The Hohenstaufens weren't just a noble family, they were the stuff of legends. For nearly a century, they sat on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, commanding lands from Germany to Sicily, their names synonymous with power and prestige. Yet by the mid-1300s they were gone, their legacy reduced to whispers and ruins. No invading hordes toppled their reign, no bloody revolt ended their line. Instead, their downfall came from a weapon far more devastating than swords, the wrath of the Church. Take Frederick II, the most brilliant and controversial of the Hohenstaufen emperors. A polymath who spoke 6 languages, wrote treatises on falconry, and dazzled courts with his intellect, he was also the man who dared to defy the Pope. When Frederick delayed his crusade to the Holy Land, Pope Gregory IX excommunicated him, not once but twice. The sentence wasn't just spiritual, it was political dynamite. Overnight, Frederick's allies wavered, his subjects questioned his divine right to rule, and enemies circled like vultures. Though he eventually reconciled with the Church, the damage was done. The stage was set for a collapse that would unfold with eerie precision. Then came the final blow, the sudden, suspicious deaths of Frederick's heirs. His son Conrad IV died of unknown causes at 26, leaving only an infant grandson, Conradin, as the last hope, but Conradin's fate was even crueler. At 16, he marched into Italy to reclaim his birthright, only to be captured and executed by his rival, Charles of Anjou. The scene was chillingly theatrical, a public beheading in Naples Market Square, a boy king kneeling before the axe. With Conradin's death in 1268, the Hohenstaufen line was extinguished forever. What makes their disappearance so haunting is the silence that followed. Their castles, like the mountain-top fortress of Castel del Monte, still stand as hollow monuments. Locals swear the ruins are cursed, that on certain nights you can hear Frederick's ghost pacing the halls, still raging against the church that doomed his dynasty. Historians debate whether the family's downfall was divine punishment or cold political calculation. But one thing's certain, their story proves that in medieval Europe, even emperors weren't safe from the slow, invisible knife of excommunication and time. The Hohenstaufens didn't just fall, they were erased, leaving behind only echoes and a warning about the price of defiance. The House of Ivria should have been immortal. Nestled in the rugged hills of northern Italy, this dynasty didn't just rule, they reshaped kingdoms. At their height, they wore the Iron Crown of Lombardy, sat on the throne of Burgundy, and even claimed the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Yet by the 1100s, their name had evaporated like morning mist over the Alps. No armies stormed their fortresses, no rivals celebrated their demise. Their disappearance was so quiet, so complete, that historians still piece together their final act like detectives at a cold crime scene. Take Berengar II, the last Ivria king to wield real power. His reign was a masterclass in how quickly fortune could turn. After years of securing alliances and expanding his territories, he made one fatal miscalculation, crossing Otto the Great, the Holy Roman Emperor. When Otto marched into Italy in 961, Berengar didn't fall in battle, he surrendered. Stripped of his crown, he died in exile, his sons reduced to mere shadows. But here's the mystery: his descendants didn't just fade into poverty. They vanished from records entirely, as if scrubbed from history's ledger. Then there's the eerie silence around Arduin, another Ivria scion who briefly became king of Italy in the year 1002. His reign lasted barely 2 years before he, too, was pushed aside not by force, but by a web of political maneuvering so subtle it left no bloodstains. Chroniclers of the time barely noted his departure, as if his existence was an inconvenience best forgotten. His children, they slipped into obscurity, their lands quietly absorbed by rival families. No fanfare, no resistance, just silence. What makes the Ivria's fate so unsettling is the absence of a clear villain. Unlike dynasties toppled by war or scandal, their end feels almost voluntary, as if they simply stepped off the stage. Their castles, like the brooding Castello di Ivria, still loom over the Italian countryside, but their halls tell no stories of downfall or betrayal. Even local legends barely whisper their name. Perhaps that's the real tragedy. When a family falls to battle, their end at least has drama, a sense of closure. But the Ivrias, they didn't get an ending, just a slow dissolve into history's background, leaving behind a single haunting question: how does a line of kings become a footnote in their own story? Their legacy isn't in ruins or chronicles, but in the quiet spaces between the lines where power once thrived and then, without warning, ceased to be. The House of Arpad didn't just rule Hungary, they built it. For over 300 years, their kings carved a kingdom from the Carpathian Basin, turning nomadic tribes into a European power. Their bloodline was so revered that Hungary's crown itself became known as the Holy Crown of Saint Stephen, their founding king. Yet by 1301, the last Arpad king lay dead, his dynasty extinguished not by rebellion or invasion, but by something far more mundane: an empty cradle. Take King Andrew III, the final Arpad monarch. His reign was a constant scramble against Hungary's fracturing nobility, but his real struggle wasn't on the battlefield, it was in the royal bedchamber. When his only child, a daughter named Elizabeth, died in infancy, the future of an entire dynasty hung by a thread. Chroniclers of the time describe Andrew as a man haunted by his legacy, desperately arranging marriages and alliances to preserve his line. But fate wasn't kind. His own death in 1301 left Hungary with no Arpad heir, only a vacuum that rival nobles scrambled to fill. What's striking is how quickly their absence was accepted. Within years, the crown passed to Charles Robert of Anjou, a distant relative through a female Arpad line. But here's the twist: no one fought to restore the old dynasty. No rebellions rose in their name. Even their ancestral lands were quietly divided among Hungary's elite, as if the Arpads had never been the bedrock of the kingdom. Perhaps the most haunting evidence of their erasure lies in Buda Castle. Walk its corridors today, and you'll find lavish tributes to Hungary's later kings, but the Arpads. A single statue of Saint Stephen, a few faded frescoes. Their absence feels deliberate, like a nation quietly turning the page on its founders. Was it sheer bad luck or something more calculated? Some historians point to the nobility's growing power in the 13th century, chafing under Arpad rule. With no strong male heir to unite them, they may have seen an opportunity to reshape Hungary's future. Others note how the dynasty's later kings, like Ladislaus IV, more interested in hunting than ruling, accelerated their own irrelevance. Whatever the cause, their disappearance holds a quiet tragedy. Most fallen dynasties leave behind ruins or rebellions, but the Arpads, they left silence. No last stand, no dramatic betrayal, just a cradle that remained empty and a throne that forgot their name. In the end, even the mightiest trees can fall without a sound. The Premyslids weren't just rulers, they were the soul of Bohemia. For over 400 years, they shaped the heart of Europe, turning Prague into a glittering capital and their kingdom into a force to be reckoned with. Yet by 1306, their line was snuffed out in a series of events so bizarre they border on Gothic fiction. No invading armies stormed their gates. No rival dynasties rallied against them. Instead, their end came in shadows, whispers of poison, a king's cryptic last words, and a throne left chillingly vacant. Take Wenceslaus III, the last Promissled king. At just 16, he inherited a realm stretched thin by ambition, his father's conquests leaving Bohemia vulnerable. Then, in July 1306, he was murdered in Olomouc, stabbed by an unknown assailant while preparing to invade Poland. The killer never found. The motive lost to time, but here's where it gets stranger. Wenceslaus died without an heir despite being married. His wife, Viola of Teschen, was conspicuously absent from court in his final months, fueling rumors of foul play. Some chroniclers hinted at a noble conspiracy, others at a personal vendetta. What's undeniable is how neatly his death cleared the way for the Luxembourg dynasty to seize power. Then there's the legend of the Premyslid curse. Long before Wenceslaus's murder, his ancestor, Saint Wenceslaus, was slain by his own brother, a betrayal that supposedly doomed the family. Centuries later, the echoes of that violence seemed to return. Wenceslaus II, the murdered king's father, died suddenly at 34, his health collapsing after years of unexplained ailments. Poison was suspected but never proven. Even the family's women weren't spared. Wenceslaus III's sister, Elizabeth, vanished into obscurity after a failed marriage, her fate as murky as her brother's. Today, walk through Prague Castle's Vladislav Hall, and you'll feel the weight of their absence. Guides swear the ghost of Wenceslaus III still lingers, his footsteps echoing in the dead of night. The Promissled throne, once the seat of kings, now sits empty, a relic behind glass, as if waiting for a ruler who will never return. So what truly ended them? History points to a perfect storm. A young king's inexperience, noble factions hungry for power, and the sheer exhaustion of a dynasty stretched too thin. But the whispers persist. Maybe the Premyslids didn't just fall, maybe they were pushed, their legacy erased to make room for a new era. One thing's certain, their disappearance wasn't an ending, but a vanishing act, leaving behind a kingdom forever wondering what might have been. The House of Welf should have been invincible. For centuries, they stood shoulder to shoulder with emperors, their bloodline weaving through the very fabric of medieval Europe. They weren't just nobles, they were kingmakers, crusaders, and the power behind thrones from Germany to Italy. Yet by the 1400s, their name had faded into obscurity, their castles abandoned like stage sets after the final act. No wars toppled them, no coups sealed their fate. Instead, their downfall came from the quietest weapon of all, the slow unraveling of alliances they themselves had woven. Take Henry the Lion, the Welf's most legendary figure. In the 1200s, he wasn't just a duke, he was a colossus, ruling over Bavaria and Saxony with an iron grip. His marriage to Matilda of England, daughter of Henry II, should have cemented his dynasty's future, but here's the twist: ambition became his undoing. When he defied Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the consequences were swift and devastating. Stripped of his lands, exiled for years, Henry returned a shadow of his former self. His sons rebuilt fragments of their inheritance, but the Welf's golden age was already slipping away. Then came the silent killer: strategic marriages gone awry. Generations of Welf daughters married into powerful families: Hohenstaufens, Habsburgs, even the English crown. Each union brought short-term glory but long-term erosion. With every bride sent away, a piece of their legacy left with her. Sons-in-law absorbed Welf lands into their own domains, diluting the family's power like ink in water. By the time Otto the Child, the last great Welf duke, died in 1252, their territories had been carved up like a feast for rival dynasties. What's haunting is how little resistance they mounted. Their ancestral stronghold, Brunswick Castle, still stands today, but its halls tell someone else's story. The Welf coat of arms, once emblazoned on banners across Europe, now hides in museum corners. Even their final descendants, the House of Hanover, rose to greatness under a different name, leaving the original Welfs as little more than a historical footnote. Perhaps that's the cruelest lesson of their disappearance. They didn't fall to swords or sieges, but to the very alliances they'd crafted to secure their future. In chess terms, they sacrificed their queens to save the king, only to realize too late that the board had been cleared around them. Their story isn't one of dramatic betrayal, but of a dynasty that quietly dissolved into the tapestry of history, leaving behind a single, lingering question: can a family be so successful at playing the game that they forget they're still pieces on the board? The House of Anjou didn't just rule, they dazzled. For 2 centuries, their kings held court in Naples and Hungary, their bloodline intertwining with Europe's most powerful dynasties. Their palaces overflowed with scholars, artists, and knights, their influence stretching from the Mediterranean to the Carpathians. Yet by the 1400s, the Angevin flame had flickered out, leaving behind empty thrones and unanswered questions. No conquering armies marched through their gates, no rebellions tore apart their courts. Instead, their disappearance was a masterclass in how dynasties could crumble from within, one whispered plot, an untimely death at a time. Take Queen Joanna I of Naples, the Angevins' most tragic figure. Her reign began with promise, a cultured ruler who patronized the arts and navigated the treacherous politics of 14th century Italy. But her downfall reads like a Shakespearean tragedy. Accused of orchestrating her husband's murder, she was entangled in a web of scandals that turned even the Pope against her. When her cousin Charles of Durazzo invaded Naples in 1381, Joanna didn't fall in battle. She was captured, imprisoned, and quietly strangled in her cell. Her death wasn't just the end of a queen, it was the unraveling of a dynasty. Then there's the eerie fate of the Hungarian Angevins. King Charles Robert's son, Louis the Great, expanded Hungary's borders to their greatest extent, only for his line to collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. His daughter, Mary, was crowned queen at 11, a child thrust onto a throne surrounded by wolves. Within years, she was kidnapped by rebellious nobles, her supporters slaughtered. Though she eventually escaped, the damage was done. Her marriage produced no heirs, and her sister Jadwiga was shipped off to Poland, severing the Angevin claim to Hungary forever. What's chilling is how ordinary their erasure seemed. Walk the halls of Naples' Castel Nuovo today, and you'll find frescoes of Aragonese kings, not Angevins. Their tombs in Hungary's Székesfehérvár Basilica lie neglected, their inscriptions weathered to near illegibility. Even their name, Anjou, faded into obscurity, absorbed by rival dynasties like a river swallowed by the sea. Was it bad luck or something more calculated? Some historians point to the Angevins' relentless expansion, stretching their bloodline too thin across too many thrones. Others note their habit of trusting the wrong allies like Joanna, who welcomed Charles of Durazzo into her court weeks before he betrayed her. But perhaps the cruelest twist is this: their greatest strength marriages that tied them to Europe's elite became their undoing. Each union diluted their identity until there was no one left to remember who the Angevins truly were. Their story isn't one of fire and sword, but of a candle snuffed by the faintest breath. No grand battles, no last stands, just a dynasty that slipped through history's fingers, leaving behind palaces that echo with the ghosts of what might have been. The Trastamaras didn't just rule Spain, they forged it. From the chaos of the 1400s, they unified Castile and Aragon, laying the groundwork for an empire that would span continents. Theirs was a name whispered in royal courts from Toledo to Naples, a dynasty seemingly destined for immortality. Yet by the 1500s they were gone, not in a blaze of glory, but in a series of quiet tragedies that left their throne empty and their legacy scattered to the wind. Take Ferdinand II of Aragon, the architect of Spain's golden age. His marriage to Isabella of Castile didn't just unite kingdoms, it birthed a superpower. Together, they funded Columbus's voyages, expelled the Moors from Granada, and turned Spain into Europe's beating heart. But their triumphs masked a cruel irony. Their children's fates would unravel everything they'd built. Their son, Prince John, died at 19, leaving no heir. Their daughter Joanna, once the brightest jewel of Europe, succumbed to a grief so consuming, history would label her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Locked away for decades, her reign existed only on paper, her voice silenced by the men who ruled in her name. Then there's the haunting case of their grandson, Charles V. Though he inherited the vast Habsburg Empire, the Trastamara blood in his veins marked the beginning of the end. His reign was one of conquest and crisis, but his son, Philip II, would be the last to bear the Trastamara name with any real power. By then, the family's identity had dissolved into the Habsburg monolith, their castles repurposed, their stories rewritten. The final blow, a series of stillbirths and sickly heirs that left Philip's line hanging by a thread. What's eerie is how little resistance there was to their disappearance. The Alcazar of Seville, once a Trastamara stronghold, became a Habsburg showpiece overnight. Chronicles that once celebrated their victories now glossed over their contributions, as if their 3 centuries of rule were a mere prelude to someone else's story. Even today, ask a Spaniard about the Trastamaras, and you might get a puzzled look, their name overshadowed by the empires that came after. So was it fate or something darker? Some historians point to the family's relentless inbreeding, a practice meant to consolidate power, but which left their gene pool a tangle of frailties. Others suspect political sabotage, rivals like the Habsburgs quietly sidelining a dynasty that had outlived its usefulness. But perhaps the truth is simpler. In the Game of Thrones, even kings are temporary pieces. The Trastamaras didn't fall, they faded, their names slipping from history's ledger as quietly as a candle guttering in a drafty hall. Their castles still stand, of course. Walk the halls of the Alhambra, and you'll find the Trastamara coat of arms tucked between Moorish arches, a ghostly reminder of the family that once ruled here. But their true legacy isn't in stone or heraldry, it's in the lesson they left behind, that no dynasty, no matter how grand, is immune to time's quiet erasure. They built Spain only to become strangers in their own story. The House of Capet didn't just rule France, they invented it. For over 300 years, their kings transformed a patchwork of warring fiefdoms into Europe's most centralized kingdom, turning the title King of the Franks into King of France. Their bloodline was so enduring that every French monarch for 8 centuries traced descent from them. Yet by 1328, their direct line had vanished, not with a bang, but with a whisper. No foreign invaders stormed the Louvre, no peasant revolts shook their throne. Instead, their fall came from something far more mundane, a series of empty cradles and a feud so petty it rewrote history. Take Philip IV, the last great Capetian monarch. Known as Philip the Fair for his striking looks, he wielded power like a hammer, crushing the Knights Templar, defying popes, and expanding royal authority like never before. But his brilliance masked a fatal flaw, an obsession with dynastic control that would unravel his legacy. When his 3 sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, each ascended the throne in turn, none produced a male heir who survived infancy. By 1328, all 3 were dead, leaving only daughters whose claims were brushed aside by a hastily invented law, the so-called Salic Law, which excluded women from succession. Conveniently, this cleared the path for Philip's nephew, Philip of Valois, to seize power, founding a new dynasty while the Capetian name faded into obscurity. What's haunting is how quickly France moved on. The Capetians had been the steady hand guiding the kingdom through crusades, plagues, and feudal wars. Yet within a generation, their memory was reduced to footnotes in chronicles. Walk through the Basilica of St. Denis today, where their tombs lie shoulder to shoulder with later kings, and you'll notice something unsettling. The most elaborate monuments belong to the Valois and Bourbons. The Capetians, their effigies are simpler, their inscriptions worn smooth by time, as if even stone conspired to forget them. But here's the twist, their disappearance wasn't total. Like a river splitting into delta streams, their blood flowed into every royal house of Europe. The Valois, the Bourbons, even the Habsburgs all traced legitimacy back to the Capetians. In a way, they achieved immortality not through their name, but through their descendants. Yet that's the cruel irony. The dynasty that built France became strangers in their own story. Their castles still stand, their laws still shape the land, but ask a Parisian about the Capetians today, and you might get a shrug. Was it bad luck or cold calculation? Some historians argue Philip IV's sons were victims of a genetic curse, their line weakened by generations of close marriages. Others suspect darker machinations, with rival nobles exploiting the succession crisis to sideline the Capetian women. But perhaps the truth lies deeper. The Capetians didn't just vanish, they were sacrificed to an idea, the notion that France needed a strong male ruler at all costs. Their daughters, like Joan of Navarre, were packed off to convents or foreign courts, their claims erased for the sake of stability. Their legacy lingers in the quietest places, in the fleur-de-lis that still adorns French towns, in the bureaucratic systems they pioneered, even in the very concept of a unified France. But their name, that slipped away, proving that sometimes the mightiest dynasties don't fall to swords. They dissolve into the ink of lawyers' parchments, their endings written not in blood but in loopholes. The House of Plantagenet didn't just rule England, they defined it. For over 300 years, their kings shaped the very soul of the nation, from the thunderous reign of Henry II to the battlefield glory of Henry V. Their bloodline ran like a scarlet thread through the Middle Ages, weaving together crusades, castles, and legends. Yet by 1485, their name had been scrubbed from the throne, their legacy reduced to whispers in the halls of their own fortresses. No cataclysmic invasion toppled them, no single rebellion shattered their power. Instead, their fall was a slow unraveling, a tapestry of family feuds, tragic accidents, and betrayals so bitter they read like a Shakespearean tragedy. Take Richard the Lionheart, the Plantagenet king who became a myth in his own lifetime. His crusades made him a European icon, but his untimely death in 1199 set a pattern of instability that would haunt his descendants. When an arrow struck him down at the Siege of Chalice, the crown passed to his brother John, the very man who would become a byword for royal failure. Magna Carta, the document John was forced to sign, didn't just curb his power, it planted the seeds of a conflict that would fester for centuries. Who truly had the right to rule England? Fast forward to the Wars of the Roses, and that question would tear the Plantagenets apart. What began as a quarrel between two branches of the family, York and Lancaster, escalated into a decades-long bloodbath. The Yorkist king Edward IV seemed to secure the dynasty's future, but his sudden death in 1483 left a 12-year-old heir, Edward V, vulnerable. Within months, the boy and his younger brother vanished inside the Tower of London, their fate a mystery that still chills the bones. Their uncle, Richard III, took the crown only to lose it and his life at Bosworth Field 2 years later. The victor, Henry Tudor, a distant cousin with a tenuous claim, who cemented his rule by marrying Elizabeth of York, the last Plantagenet princess. The irony is almost poetic. The Plantagenets didn't fall to outsiders, they devoured themselves. Their castles, like the towering keep of Dover or the haunting ruins of Fotheringhay, still stand as monuments to their vanished glory. But step inside and you'll notice something eerie. The heraldry that once proclaimed their power now gathers dust in glass cases, the royal inventories that listed their treasures. Repurposed for Tudor kings, even their greatest legacy, English common law, is rarely credited to them. Was their disappearance inevitable? Some historians argue the Plantagenets were victims of their own ambition, their empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees until it snapped under its own weight. Others point to their infamous temper, the Plantagenet rage, that fueled both their brilliance and their self-destruction. But perhaps the cruelest twist is this: their blood still flows in Britain's veins. Every monarch since Henry VIII traces lineage back to them, yet their name is a ghost, remembered more for its absence than its glory. Their story isn't one of conquest or catastrophe, but of a dynasty that burned too bright to last. No single blow felled them, just 1,000 cuts, each dealt by hands that once bore their own banner. The Plantagenets didn't just vanish, they became strangers in the kingdom they built, their final epitaph written not in chronicles, but in the quiet spaces between the stones of their own castles. The House of Valois should have been France's eternal dynasty. For over 260 years, they steered the kingdom through Renaissance and rebellion, their reigns marked by glittering courts and brutal religious wars. From the Louvre's gilded halls to the battlefields of Italy, their name was synonymous with power. Yet by 1589, they were gone, not toppled by revolt or foreign invasion, but erased by a curse of biology and backroom deals that left their throne shockingly vacant. Take Henry II, the Valois king whose reign seemed to promise unshakable stability. His marriage to Catherine de' Medici united French and Italian ambitions, and their 10 children should have secured the dynasty for generations. But fate had other plans. Henry's tragic death in 1559, a splinter from a jousting lance piercing his eye, unleashed a domino effect of disasters. His sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, each inherited the crown in turn, yet none lived past 40. Worse still, not one produced a healthy heir. Francis died at 16, possibly from ear infection or poisoning. Charles succumbed to tuberculosis at 23, raving about Protestant conspiracies. Henry III, the last hope, was stabbed by a fanatical monk in 1589, his bloodline ending with a whimper rather than a war cry. Then there's the haunting subplot of the Valois women. Margaret of Valois, Catherine's daughter, became Queen of Navarre, a brilliant match on paper, but her marriage to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, ignited France's wars of religion. When Henry converted to Catholicism to claim the French throne as Henry IV, Margaret was quietly sidelined. Their union, meant to unite factions, instead became a footnote. Even more tragic, the younger Valois daughters like Claude and Elizabeth married into foreign courts, their potential heirs absorbed by other dynasties. The family's legacy didn't just fade, it was scattered like seeds in the wind, taking root everywhere but home. Walk through the Château de Blois today, and you'll feel the weight of their absence. The palace's famous spiral staircase, where Henry III's assassins may have lurked, now echoes with tourist footsteps instead of royal intrigue. The Valois coat of arms still adorns the walls, but it's overshadowed by the Bourbon fleur-de-lis. Even their greatest architectural triumph, the Tuileries Palace, burned to the ground in 1871, as if history itself was determined to erase their fingerprints. What makes their disappearance so unsettling is the sheer mundanity of it. Most dynasties fall to swords or scandals, but the Valois, they were undone by something as random as a jousting accident, as trivial as a monk's knife. Some historians argue their inbreeding generations of cousin marriages weakened their line. Others point to Catherine de' Medici's ruthless politicking, which prioritized short-term victories over long-term survival. But perhaps the cruelest twist is this: their blood still flows in Europe's veins. From the Habsburgs to the Medicis, the Valois legacy lives on, just not under their name. Their story isn't one of conquest or collapse, but of a candle guttering in a drafty hall. No fanfare marked their exit, no ballads mourned their passing. They simply stepped off history's stage, leaving behind palaces that whisper their name only to those who listen closely. In the end, even kings are at the mercy of time, and the Valois learned that lesson too well. The House of Burgundy didn't just rule, they dazzled. For over a century, their dukes turned a modest territory into Europe's wealthiest playground, their courts brimming with tapestries, gold, and artists like Van Eyck. Burgundy wasn't just a state, it was a spectacle, a cultural force that rivaled kingdoms twice its size. Yet by 1477, their dynasty had evaporated, their legacy swallowed whole by the very marriages meant to secure it. No army stormed Dijon, no rebellions toppled their throne. Instead, their end came through a twist of fate so improbable, it feels like fiction. Take Charles the Bold, the last duke who embodied Burgundy's soaring ambitions. His dream, to forge a middle kingdom between France and Germany, a Burgundian empire crowned with his own royal title. But his relentless wars drained the treasury, and his only heir was a daughter, Mary. In a world where power flowed through sons, this was a vulnerability one his enemies exploited. When Charles fell at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, his body wasn't found for days, frozen beneath the snow like a forgotten relic. Mary, just 19, inherited a realm on the brink. What happened next was less a succession than a feeding frenzy. To save Burgundy, Mary wed Maximilian of Habsburg, a union that should have fortified her borders. But instead of preserving her dynasty, it erased it. When Mary died in a hunting accident 5 years later, some say thrown from her horse, others whisper pushed. Their son Philip inherited her titles, but the Burgundian name didn't follow. The Habsburgs absorbed everything, her lands, her art, even her courtiers. Within a generation, Burgundy was just a memory, a placeholder in Habsburg genealogy. The real tragedy lies in the details. Walk the halls of the Palace of the Dukes in Dijon today, and you'll find no trace of the family's luminous past. Their famed library dispersed, their golden altarpieces looted or repurposed. Even their tombs were relocated, stripped of context, their inscriptions fading into obscurity. The Burgundian tapestries that once depicted their triumphs now hang in Vienna's museums, labeled as Habsburg treasures. Was their disappearance inevitable? Some historians argue Charles the Bold's recklessness doomed them, a man who gambled his legacy on battlefields and lost. Others point to the ruthless marriage market of medieval Europe, where daughters were bridges, not anchors. But perhaps the cruelest twist is this: the Burgundians didn't just vanish, they were consumed by the very strategy they'd mastered, the art of alliance. In weaving themselves into Europe's fabric, they forgot to leave a thread that could be pulled back. Their story lingers in the whispers of Bruges canals and the empty niches where their statues once stood. No plaques commemorate them, no anniversaries mark their fall. They're the ghost at Europe's feast, a reminder that even the grandest dynasties can dissolve into the ink of a marriage contract, leaving behind only the echo of what might have been. The House of Avis should have been Portugal's eternal dynasty. For nearly 200 years, they transformed a small kingdom on Europe's edge into a global empire, their ships carving paths to Africa, India, and Brazil. Their kings were adventurers and visionaries, men like Henry the Navigator, who charted oceans, and Manuel the Fortunate, whose reign dripped with gold from Lisbon's newfound trade routes. Yet by 1580, their line was extinguished, not by cannon fire or rebellion, but by a twist of fate so absurd it feels like divine mockery, a young king's reckless gallop on a summer afternoon. Take King Sebastian, the last true Avis monarch. Crowned at 3 years old, he grew up on tales of crusades and conquest, determined to outshine his ancestors. In 1578, against all counsel, he led a doomed expedition to Morocco, vowing to reclaim lost Christian lands. The Battle of Alcácer Quibir was a slaughter. Sebastian vanished in the chaos, his body never found, leaving Portugal without a king, without an heir, and without a clear path forward. The throne passed to his elderly uncle, Cardinal Henry, a man more suited to sermons than statecraft. When Henry died just 2 years later, the Avis dynasty died with him, leaving a vacuum that Spain's Habsburgs would eagerly fill. What makes their disappearance so unsettling is how avoidable it was. For generations, the Avis kings had married strategically, producing heirs like clockwork. But Sebastian's father, Prince John, died weeks before his birth, and his mother, Joanna of Spain, was shipped back to Madrid, leaving the boy isolated in a court of scheming uncles. By the time he reached adulthood, his obsession with glory overshadowed his duty to secure the succession. He refused marriage, dismissing potential brides with cryptic vows of chastity. Even his closest advisors whispered that he seemed more monk than monarch, a man racing toward martyrdom while his dynasty crumbled behind him. Then there's the haunting aftermath. With no Avis heir, Portugal's nobles scrambled for solutions. Some backed Antonio, an illegitimate grandson of King Manuel, but his claim was shaky. Others turned to Philip II of Spain, whose armies marched into Lisbon unopposed. The courts, Portugal's assembly, ratified his rule in 1581, but the price was steep: 60 years of Spanish domination, where Avis palaces became Habsburg guest houses, and Portugal's empire was bled dry to fund Madrid's wars. Walk through Lisbon's Jeronimo's monastery today, and you'll find the Avis kings entombed in splendor, but their legacy is a ghostly presence. The Manuline architecture, with its ropes and sea monsters carved in stone, screams of their maritime triumphs. Yet the tour guides hurry past their tombs to gush about Vasco da Gama. Even the famed Tower of Belém, their sentinel over the Tagus, is now just a postcard backdrop. Its connection to the dynasty faded like ink in the sun. So was it tragedy or negligence that erased them? Some historians blame Sebastian's recklessness, a boy king chasing myths while his kingdom slipped away. Others argue the Aves were victims of their own success, so focused on global empire, they forgot to tend the roots at home. But perhaps the cruelest twist is this: their blood still flows in European royalty, from the Braganzas who eventually reclaimed Portugal's throne to modern descendants scattered across courts. Yet their name Aves is barely remembered, a whisper in the wind off the Atlantic they once ruled. Their story isn't one of conquest or cataclysm, but of a dynasty that forgot the simplest rule: empires outlive kings only if kings outlive themselves. The Aves didn't fall to invaders or infighting, they tripped over their own ambitions, leaving behind a kingdom that mourned not their passing, but the future they failed to protect. The House of Jagiellon didn't just rule, they built an empire of ink and parchment, binding Poland and Lithuania into the largest kingdom Europe had ever seen. At their peak, their influence stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, their courts buzzing with Renaissance artists and scheming diplomats. Yet by 1572, their name had slipped from the throne, not with a clash of swords, but with the quiet turning of a page in the history books. No wars shattered their power, no coups toppled their castles. Instead, their fall was a slow unraveling, a tapestry of marriages that blurred their legacy and deaths that came too soon. Take Sigismund II Augustus, the last Jagiellon king of Poland. A man of contradictions, he presided over the golden age of Polish culture while watching his personal life crumble. 3 wives, none of whom bore him an heir, passed through his chambers like shadows. The first, Elizabeth of Austria, died young, possibly poisoned. The second, Barbara Radziwill, a scandalous love match, succumbed to illness after just 6 months as queen. The third, Catherine of Austria, outlived him but left no child to carry the dynasty forward. When Sigismund died in 1572, his death wasn't just the end of a king. It was the closing of a bloodline that had shaped Eastern Europe for nearly 2 centuries. Then there's the haunting irony of their expansion. The Jagiellons didn't just marry for politics, they married for empire, tying themselves to Hungary, Bohemia, and beyond. But each union, while dazzling on paper, diluted their identity. When Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia fell at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, the eastern branches of the family withered overnight. His sister Anna became a pawn in the Habsburgs' game, her son inheriting nothing of the Jagiellon name. Even in Lithuania, where their roots ran deepest, the family's influence seeped away like water through cracks in a fortress wall. Walk through the corridors of Wall Castle in Krakow today, and you'll feel their absence like a draft. The Jagiellon tapestries still hang in the grand halls, but their symbolism has faded. The portraits of long-faced kings gaze down from the walls, their stories reduced to museum placards. Even their greatest achievement, the Union of Lublin in 1569, which permanently united Poland and Lithuania, is remembered as a national milestone, not a Jagiellon triumph. What makes their disappearance so unsettling is how thoroughly they were erased. Most fallen dynasties leave behind rebels or pretenders, but the Jagiellons. Their legacy was absorbed without protest. When Sigismund's sister, Anna Jagiellon, was elected queen in 1575, it was a hollow victory. She ruled alongside a Habsburg husband, her name a placeholder until foreign blood could take the throne. By the time she died in 1596, the Jagiellon era was already a footnote, its memory kept alive only by historians and the occasional aristocrat tracing a faded pedigree. Was it bad luck or something more deliberate? Some scholars point to the family's refusal to adapt, clinging to medieval notions of legitimacy while Europe's power structures shifted around them. Others argue their marriages, though brilliant, were their undoing, each alliance a thread pulled from the tapestry until nothing remained. But perhaps the cruelest twist is this: their blood still flows in veins across Europe, from Sweden to Spain. The Jagiellons didn't vanish, they dissolved like sugar in tea, leaving behind a sweetness no one quite remembers tasting. Their castles stand empty, their names half forgotten, but their lesson lingers, that even the grandest dynasties are just ink on parchment, waiting for the next hand to turn the page. The House of Vasa should have been invincible. They pulled Sweden from the brink of collapse, turning a fractured kingdom into a Baltic powerhouse. Their kings wore crowns in both Stockholm and Warsaw, their bloodline threading through two nations like a double-edged sword. Yet by the mid-1700s, their name had evaporated from Europe's royal registers, not erased by war or revolution, but by a slow, almost polite fade into obscurity. No dramatic last stand, no tragic final heir, just a series of empty nurseries and political miscalculations that left their throne as hollow as a dried-up husk. Take Sigismund III, the Vasa monarch who embodied their soaring ambitions and fatal flaws. King of Poland and Sweden, he dreamed of uniting both realms under Catholic rule. But his zeal backfired spectacularly. Protestant Sweden rebelled, deposing him in 1599, while Poland's nobles chafed under his absolutist tendencies. Though he clung to the Polish crown, his son Ladislaus IV inherited a fractured legacy. A brilliant diplomat, Ladislaus kept peace through sheer charisma, but his death in 1648 revealed the dynasty's Achilles heel: no legitimate heir. His half-brother John Casimir took over, but by then the cracks were too deep. Then came the final twist: biology itself seemed to conspire against them. John Casimir's wife, Marie-Louise Gonzaga, was a political genius who masterminded Poland's survival during the Deluge, a brutal invasion by Sweden and Russia. But for all her brilliance, she couldn't produce a living heir. After 2 stillbirths and an infant death, the couple's hopes crumbled. When John Casimir abdicated in 1668, he became a literal monk, retreating to a French abbey as if surrendering to fate. The Polish throne passed to a noble outsider, while Sweden's branch of the Vasas had already fizzled out decades earlier with Queen Christina's shocking abdication. Christina, the enigma who sealed their fate. Crowned queen at 6, she was a prodigy who spoke 8 languages and hosted Europe's greatest minds in her court. But her refusal to marry, followed by her sudden conversion to Catholicism and move to Rome in 1654, severed Sweden's Vasa line forever. Some whispered she'd been poisoned by her own advisors. Others claimed she simply found crowns too heavy. Whatever the truth, her departure left Sweden scrambling, her throne passing to a distant cousin whose name wasn't Vasa at all. What's haunting is how thoroughly their legacy was overwritten. Walk through Warsaw's royal castle today, and you'll find Vasa portraits tucked between Piasts and Sobieskis, their faces blurred by time. Stockholm's Tre Krona Palace, once their seat of power, burned to the ground in 1697, almost symbolic of their erasure. Even their greatest achievements, like Sweden's rise as a military power, are credited to later kings. So was it bad luck or blind spots? Some historians argue the Vasas were architects of their own demise, prioritizing personal piety over dynastic survival. Others point to the brutal calculus of 17th century politics, where religious divides trumped bloodlines. But perhaps the cruelest irony is this: their descendants still walk among us. From Belgium's royals to modern-day aristocrats, Vasa blood endures, just not their name. They didn't so much disappear as dissolve, like sugar in coffee, leaving behind a sweetness no one thinks to name. Their story lingers in the quietest places, in the gilt frames of forgotten portraits, in the Latin inscriptions on weathered tombs, in the way history remembers their deeds but forgets the hands that wrought them. The Vosses didn't fall, they stepped sideways, vanishing into the wings while the play marched on without them. The House of Oldenburg didn't just rule, they endured. For over 6 centuries, their branches stretched across northern Europe, from the windswept cliffs of Denmark to the frozen fjords of Norway. They were survivors, weathering wars, plagues, and rebellions with a knack for bending without breaking. Yet by the 1800s, their direct line had vanished like a ship swallowed by fog, not in the roar of cannon fire, but in the hushed whispers of lawyers and the cold arithmetic of inheritance laws. Take Christian VIII, the last Oldenburg king of Denmark who truly embodied the dynasty's fading glory. A man of culture and contradiction, he championed liberal reforms while clinging to absolute monarchy, a balancing act that left him beloved by artists but distrusted by his own court. When he died in 1848, the crown passed to his son, Frederick VII, a king who would become more famous for what he didn't do than what he did. Frederick's 3 marriages produced no legitimate heirs, a fact that turned Denmark's royal future into a chessboard for European powers. But here's the twist, the Oldenburgs didn't just run out of sons. They ran out of legitimacy. The crisis had been brewing for generations. The Oldenburgs had always relied on strategic marriages to secure their thrones, but by the 19th century, Europe's shifting alliances made those ties a liability. When Frederick's cousin, Christian of Glucksburg, was tapped as heir, it wasn't just a succession, it was a rebranding. The Glucksburgs were Oldenburgs by blood, but not by name, and Denmark's parliament seized the moment to formalize a constitutional monarchy, stripping the crown of its ancient powers. The Oldenburg era ended not with a bang, but with a signature on a piece of parchment. Norway's branch fared even stranger. The Oldenburgs had ruled there since the 1400s, but when Norway was ceded to Sweden in 1814, their local line was quietly sidelined. The last Oldenburg king, Christian Frederick, briefly declared Norway's independence in 1814, only to abdicate months later under pressure. His descendants lingered in the shadows, their claims fading into genealogical footnotes. What's haunting is how little mourning followed their disappearance. Walk through Copenhagen's Rosenborg Castle today, and you'll find rooms frozen in time, ivory chess sets untouched, portraits of stern Oldenburg kings staring blankly at tourists. But the guides don't speak of them as a lost dynasty. They're just ancestors, stepping stones to the modern monarchy. Even their tombs at Roskilde Cathedral feel like afterthoughts, overshadowed by the flashier sarcophagi of Viking kings. Was it negligence or inevitability? Some historians argue the Oldenburgs were victims of their own adaptability, so skilled at survival that they forgot to cement their identity. Others point to the rising tide of nationalism, where ancient bloodlines mattered less than bureaucratic efficiency, but perhaps the truth lies in their castles. Unlike ruined fortresses that speak of violent ends, the Oldenburgs' palaces Frederiksborg, Amalienborg, Christiansborg still stand pristine, repurposed as museums and government buildings. Their legacy wasn't destroyed, it was renovated, their name plastered over like an old coat of arms beneath fresh paint. Their blood still flows, of course. The Glucksburgs reign in Denmark today, and Oldenburg descendants sit on half a dozen European thrones. But the name itself, that slipped away, proving that even the hardiest dynasties can vanish without a sound, leaving behind palaces full of echoes and a lesson. Sometimes the quietest exits are the ones history forgets to record. The Habsburgs didn't just rule Europe, they were Europe. For nearly 6 centuries, their name echoed through the halls of power from Madrid to Vienna, their bloodline stitching together an empire so vast the sun never set on it. Kings, emperors, even popes bore their double-headed eagle crest. Yet by 1700, their male line had withered away, not on battlefields, but in the gilded cages of their own making. Their downfall wasn't written in blood, it was etched in the twisted branches of their family tree. Take Charles II of Spain, the living embodiment of their unraveling. The last Habsburg king of Spain, his reign was a grotesque caricature of dynastic decay. His jaw jutted so far forward he couldn't chew. His tongue swelled so large, speech was a struggle. Chroniclers described him as bewitched, but the truth was far darker. Generations of uncle-niece marriages had turned the Habsburg gene pool into a stagnant pond. When Charles died childless in 1700, his autopsy noted a heart the size of a peppercorn and a single shriveled testicle, a biological dead end for a dynasty that once thought itself invincible. Meanwhile, the Austrian branch fared little better. Emperor Charles VI spent decades strong-arming Europe to recognize his daughter, Maria Theresa, as heir, a desperate bid to keep the Habsburg name alive. But the pragmatic sanction, his landmark decree, was less a triumph than a surrender. When Maria Theresa took the throne in 1740, she did so not as a Habsburg, but as the wife of Francis of Lorraine, their name quietly folded into the new House of Habsburg-Lorraine. The dynasty hadn't just faded, it had been rebranded. What's chilling is how ordinary their erasure seemed. Walk through Vienna's Hofburg Palace today, and you'll find Habsburg portraits lining the walls, but their story ends abruptly, like a book missing its final chapter. Their greatest fortress, the Escorial in Spain, stands as a mausoleum to their vanity, its pantheon of kings crowded with marble effigies of chinless men who died too young. Even their signature policy, marry, don't conquer, became their epitaph. By wedding cousins to keep power in the family, they'd unknowingly signed their own extinction warrant. Was it arrogance or ignorance that doomed them? Some historians argue their obsession with purity blinded them to the costs. Others point to Europe's shifting tides, where coalitions mattered more than bloodlines. But perhaps the cruelest twist is this: their legacy lives on in the very thing they feared most: change. The Habsburgs didn't just vanish, they evolved, their name diluted into the modern monarchies they once scorned. Their lesson lingers in genetics textbooks and royal nurseries alike, that even empires built on marriage beds can crumble when the bed itself becomes a tomb. The House of Romanov didn't just fall, they unraveled like a thread pulled from a tapestry. For 300 years, they'd ruled Russia with an iron grip, their names synonymous with absolute power. From Peter the Great's westernizing reforms to Catherine's glittering expansion, they built an empire that spanned continents. Yet by 1917, their reign collapsed not under foreign invasion, but under the weight of their own isolation. The revolution that toppled them was explosive, but their decline had been decades in the making, a slow poison of missteps and miscalculations that left them blind to the storm ahead. Take Nicholas II, the last Romanov Tsar. On paper, he inherited a thriving empire, but his reign was a masterclass in tone-deaf leadership, while workers starved in St. Petersburg's slums, he poured rubles into futile wars like the Russo-Japanese conflict, where Russia's humiliating defeat in 1905 exposed the rot beneath the gilded surface. When protesters marched on the Winter Palace that same year, pleading for bread and reform, Nicholas responded not with compromise, but with bullets. Bloody Sunday became the spark that would smolder for 12 more years before igniting revolution. Then there's the Rasputin factor, the bizarre subplot that epitomized the dynasty's disconnect. The royal family's obsession with the so-called mad monk wasn't just a scandal, it was a symptom. Desperate to cure his hemophiliac heir Alexei, Nicholas and Alexandra handed Rasputin alarming influence over state affairs, alienating nobles and commoners alike. When aristocrats finally murdered Rasputin in 1916, they didn't just kill a man, they severed the last thread of public trust in the Romanovs' judgment. But the true unraveling came from within. While Europe industrialized, the Romanovs clung to medieval notions of divine right. They dismissed the Duma, Russia's fledgling parliament, as a nuisance. They ignored rising socialist fervor until Petrograd's bread riots in 1917 became an avalanche they couldn't outrun. Nicholas's abdication that March wasn't just a political act, it was an admission that 3 centuries of Romanov rule had left no allies, only ghosts. Even their final chapter feels like a cruel joke of history. After the Bolsheviks seized power, the family wasn't executed in some grand public spectacle. They were hidden away in a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg, their existence an inconvenience. When the order came in July 1918, it was carried out in a basement, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves like common criminals. The jewels sewn into their clothes, meant to fund an escape that never came, were the last pitiful symbols of a dynasty that mistrusted paper money until the end. Today, walk through the Winter Palace and you'll find Romanov portraits hanging like afterthoughts between socialist-realist murals. Their summer palaces are museums now, their gilded ballrooms silent. Even their remains, recovered decades later, sparked more controversy than mourning. The Romanovs didn't just lose their throne, they lost their place in Russia's story, reduced to cautionary tales and conspiracy theories. Their disappearance holds a warning older than time, that no dynasty, no matter how mighty, survives when it forgets the ground beneath its feet. The Romanovs didn't fall to guns or armies. They crumbled under the weight of their own illusions, leaving behind a country that would spend decades trying to erase their memory. In the end, even tsars are just flesh and bone, and history has little patience for those who mistake crowns for invincibility. The House of Savoy didn't just rule Italy, they built it. For nearly a century, their kings stood as living symbols of a unified nation, their palaces dotting the peninsula from Turin to Rome. Victor Emmanuel II, the first king of a united Italy, was practically carved into the country's mythos, the father of the fatherland. Yet by 1946, their 1,000-year dynasty ended not with a revolution or a coup, but with something far more mundane, a ballot box. In the space of a single summer, the Savoys went from royal palaces to exile, their throne abolished by popular vote. No armies stormed the Quirinal Palace, no mobs burned their portraits, just the quiet, crushing weight of democracy deciding they were no longer needed. The writing had been on the wall for decades. While the Savoys played at being modern monarchs, their grip on Italy's heart had been slipping. King Umberto II, nicknamed the May King for his tragically brief reign, inherited a crown already cracked by his father's mistakes. Victor Emmanuel III's fatal error, aligning with Mussolini, though he'd later dismissed the dictator in 1943, the damage was irreversible. Italians remembered the king's silence as fascism tightened its grip, how he'd signed racial laws stripping Jews of rights, how he'd fled Rome when the war turned. By 1946, the country wanted not just a new government, but a clean break from the past. The referendum wasn't merely about monarchy versus republic, it was a verdict on the Savoys themselves. What's striking is how little resistance they mounted. When the votes were tallied 12 million to 10 in favor of a republic, Umberto didn't fight. He didn't rally loyalists or contest the results. He simply boarded a plane to Portugal, leaving behind a note urging Italians to avoid fratricidal conflict. His departure was so anticlimactic, it felt like a metaphor for the entire dynasty's end. a king exiting stage left while the audience had already moved on. Today, their legacy lingers in eerie ways. The Palazzo Reale in Turin, once their opulent seat, is now a museum where tourists gawk at ballrooms frozen in time. The crown jewels, hidden during the war, resurfaced decades later in a Swiss vault, a glittering reminder of a kingdom that no longer existed. Even their exile had a bizarre postscript. In 2002, after 56 years, the Italian government finally repealed the constitutional ban on male Savoys returning. When Prince Vittorio Emanuele Umberto's son crossed the border, the headlines were less about restoration than curiosity, like a ghost wandering back into a world that had long since rebuilt without him. Perhaps the cruelest irony lies in their own bloodline. The Savoys had mastered survival for centuries, bending with every shift in Europe's political winds. But in the end, they misread the deepest current of all, the idea that crowns derive power not from God but from people. Their palaces still stand, their art still dazzles, but their lesson is carved into Italy's streets, that even the oldest dynasties can vanish overnight when they forget the ground beneath their feet. The House of Braganza didn't just rule Portugal, they were Portugal. For nearly 300 years, they steered the nation through earthquakes, invasions, and an empire that spanned continents. Their kings rebuilt Lisbon after the catastrophic 1755 earthquake. Their queens smuggled state secrets in their petticoats during the Napoleonic Wars, and their explorers planted the Portuguese flag from Brazil to Macau. Yet by 1910, their throne sat empty, their palaces silent, not because of a foreign conqueror, but because of a single morning in October when the people of Lisbon simply walked away from them. The unraveling began with King Carlos I, a monarch whose passions leaned more toward oceanography than statecraft. While he penned scholarly papers on deep-sea fish, Portugal simmered with discontent, republican protests, colonial failures, and a treasury drained by royal extravagance. Then, on February 1, 1908, Carlos and his heir, Luis Felipe, were gunned down in Lisbon's Terreiro do Poço Square. The assassins weren't foreign agents or rival nobles. They were Portuguese army officers, disillusioned and armed with rifles bought from a local shop. Carlos's younger son, Manuel II, inherited a crown already cracking beneath his feet. Manuel's reign lasted barely 2 years, a desperate scramble to modernize a monarchy the public had already deemed obsolete. His downfall wasn't dramatic, it was bureaucratic. On October 5, 1910, Republican soldiers and civilians seized key government buildings in Lisbon. There were no grand battles, no last stands. By afternoon, Manuel was aboard a British yacht bound for exile, clutching a handful of family jewels and a copy of Shakespeare's Hamlet, a fitting choice for a king who'd inherited a poisoned throne. What's haunting is how quickly Portugal moved on. The Braganza's palaces, like the pink-hued Palacio Nacional da Pina, were converted into museums or left to gather dust. Their portraits were taken down from government offices, their coats of arms chiseled off public buildings. Even their language changed. The royal "we" vanished from decrees, replaced by the brusque directives of republicanism. The family itself fractured in exile. Manuel died childless in England in 1932, his widow burning his personal papers to protect his legacy, or perhaps to bury it. Yet their ghost lingers. Walk through Lisbon's Alfama district today, and you'll hear fado songs that still mourn the good King Carlos. The Braganza jewels, smuggled out in 1910, resurfaced decades later in a Swiss vault, their return sparking more curiosity than nostalgia. Even their descendants carry the paradox. Duarte Pio, the current claimant, styles himself as Duke of Braganza, but his citizenship was only restored in 1976, after Portugal's democracy deemed royalty harmless. Their disappearance holds a quiet lesson. that dynasties don't always fall to cannons or coups. Sometimes they're undone by sheer irrelevance, their final act not a tragedy but a shrug. The Braganzas didn't just lose a crown, they lost their place in the story they'd helped write, becoming footnotes in a republic that barely remembers their name. The House of Bourbon didn't just rule, they defined an era. For centuries, their name was etched into the very fabric of France and Spain, their bloodline threading through palaces, treaties, and wars that shaped Europe. Louis XIV, the Sun King, built Versailles as a monument to their glory, while Spain's Bourbon kings presided over an empire where the sun never set. Yet by the 20th century, their thrones stood empty, their power evaporated not by conquest, but by the shifting tides of politics, a slow fade from grandeur to irrelevance. Take Louis XVI, the king who lost France. His reign began with promise, but his inability to navigate the storm of revolution sealed his fate. When bread riots turned into the storming of the Bastille in 1789, Louis hesitated too late to reform, too early to crush dissent. His attempted escape in 1791, the infamous flight to Varennes, wasn't just a failure, it was a public confession of how out of touch the Bourbons had become. Captured and dragged back to Paris, he became a prisoner in his own palace, his divine right to rule stripped away by the very people who'd once bowed to him. His execution in 1793 wasn't just the death of a king. It was the death of an idea, the belief that Bourbon blood alone could command a nation. Yet the Bourbons were never ones to stay buried. After Napoleon's fall, they were restored to the French throne in 1814, as if the revolution had been a bad dream. But the magic was gone. Charles X, Louis's brother, clung so tightly to absolute power that he sparked the July Revolution of 1830, sending him fleeing to England with little more than a suitcase of family jewels. The crown passed to his cousin, Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king, who tried to modernize the monarchy, only to be toppled in 1848 when Parisians decided they'd had enough of kings altogether. The Bourbons didn't just lose a throne, they lost their place in France's story, their palaces converted into museums before the paint on their portraits had even dried. Spain's Bourbons fared slightly better, but only just. Alfonso XIII, who ruled from birth in 1886, watched his country unravel under colonial losses and political infighting. When elections in 1931 went against the monarchy, he didn't wait for a mob. He simply left Madrid declaring, "I want no drop of blood spilled for me." His departure was so quiet, it felt less like an abdication and more like a man stepping off a train he realized wasn't his. Though the Bourbons would later return to Spain under Juan Carlos in 1975, their restoration was a fragile thing, a constitutional monarchy with clipped wings, a far cry from the absolute power they'd once wielded. What's haunting is how thoroughly their legacy was rewritten. Versailles, once the beating heart of Bourbon power, is now a tourist attraction where visitors marvel at Hall of Mirrors selfies. The Bourbon Palace in Paris, it houses the National Assembly, its royal corridors buzzing with politicians who'd never bow to a king. Even in Spain, where the monarchy persists, the Bourbons are more figureheads than rulers, their influence measured in photo ops rather than decrees. Was their downfall inevitable? Some historians argue the Bourbons were victims of their own rigidity, unable to adapt as Europe democratized. Others point to their fatal flaw, a belief that bloodline alone could sustain power in a world increasingly governed by ballots, not birthright. But perhaps the cruelest twist is this: their blood still flows in Europe's veins, from Luxembourg's Grand Dukes to pretenders in exile. The Bourbons didn't disappear, they were diluted, their name reduced to a brand that history outgrew. Their palaces still stand, their portraits still gaze down from museum walls, but their lesson lingers, that no dynasty, no matter how glittering, survives when it mistakes tradition for invincibility. The Bourbons didn't fall to cannon fire or coups, they slipped away like sand through fingers, leaving behind gilded halls that echo with the ghosts of what they once believed was eternal. The House of Orléans should have been France's forever dynasty. As cadet branches go, they had everything: royal blood, vast estates, and a name that once made kings nervous. For decades, they lurked in the wings of French power, poised to inherit the throne should the main Bourbon line falter. And when revolution toppled Louis Philippe in 1848, their moment seemed to arrive at last. Yet by the 20th century, the Orléans had become ghosts in their own country, their influence erased not by guillotines or coups, but by something far more insidious: the quiet erosion of relevance. Consider Louis Philippe himself, the so-called citizen king, who ruled France from 1830 to 1848. His reign was a paradox: a monarch who dressed like a banker, walked the streets without guards, and called himself King of the French rather than King of France, as if to acknowledge the people's sovereignty. But his attempts to modernize the monarchy backfired spectacularly. When bread shortages sparked protests in Paris, Louis Philippe didn't double down on absolutism like his Bourbon cousins. Instead, he simply left. One February morning, he disguised himself as Mr. Smith, boarded a carriage, and slipped across the Channel to England. The throne wasn't stolen from him. He vacated it like a tenant abandoning a lease. The Orléans never recovered from that moment of abdication. His grandson, Philippe VII, spent decades in exile plotting a return, but France had moved on. The Second Empire under Napoleon III crushed their hopes, and even after its fall in 1870, the new French Republic had no appetite for restoring kings, especially not ones whose claim now felt like ancient history. The family became permanent guests at Europe's royal weddings, their presence a polite nod to a past nobody wanted to resurrect. What's haunting is how thoroughly they were forgotten. The Palais Royal in Paris, once their glittering headquarters where nobles gambled fortunes in gilded salons, was nationalized and repurposed. Their country estates, like the Château de Chantilly, became museums, their portraits gathering dust beside signage explaining former royal residences. Even their legacy was rewritten. Louis Philippe's greatest achievement, the colonization of Algeria, is now taught in French schools as a colonial crime rather than a royal triumph. But here's the twist: the Orléans never truly disappeared. Like a shadow at noon, they've lingered at the edges of French society. In the 1980s, Henry VI even ran for president. He received a dismal 0.2% of the vote. Today, their descendants still host charity galas and grant interviews about the future of monarchy, though the public meets their claims with polite indifference. Their story isn't one of violent overthrow, but of a family that misread the room. The Orléans gambled that France would always want a king, just a more modern, approachable one. They didn't realize that by the 20th century, the very idea of royalty had become a costume nobody wished to wear. Their castles still stand, their titles still echo in aristocratic circles, but their lesson lingers: that power, once lost, is far harder to reclaim when the world decides it no longer needs you. The Grimaldis of Monaco are the ultimate survivors, a dynasty that dodged extinction not once, but multiple times, clinging to their rocky principality like sailors to a life raft. While their name still graces Monaco's palaces today, there were moments when the family stood one misstep away from vanishing into history's footnotes. Unlike the tragic tales of other noble houses, their story is a masterclass in audacity, luck, and the occasional stroke of sheer absurdity that kept them afloat. Take the year 1949, when Prince Louis II, the reigning Grimaldi monarch, faced a crisis that would have doomed lesser dynasties: no legitimate heir. His only child, Charlotte, was born out of wedlock, and Monaco's succession laws were murky at best. The solution: a hastily arranged adoption. In a move that blurred the lines between family and farce, Louis legally adopted his own daughter to secure her place in the line of succession. But even that wasn't enough. Charlotte, overwhelmed by the pressures of royal life, eventually abdicated her rights in favor of her son, Rainier. It was a patchwork fix, stitching together legitimacy with legal loopholes, but it worked. Then there's the curious case of Monaco's near annexation. In the early 20th century, the Grimaldis' grip on their tiny realm seemed precarious. France, encircling Monaco on all sides, grew impatient with the principality's status as a tax haven for the wealthy. Tensions peaked in 1962, when President Charles de Gaulle threatened to cut off Monaco's water and electricity unless they reformed their banking laws. Prince Rainier, facing the prospect of ruling a kingdom without lights or running water, struck a deal ceding some sovereignty but keeping the crown. It was a diplomatic high-wire act, one that could have ended with Monaco becoming just another French postcode. But perhaps the Grimaldis' greatest escape came from an unlikely source: Hollywood. Rainier's marriage to Grace Kelly in 1956 didn't just bring glamour to Monaco, it brought global attention. Suddenly, the world cared about this microscopic monarchy. The wedding was a masterstroke of public relations, transforming the Grimaldis from fading aristocrats into international celebrities. Grace's tragic death in 1982 only cemented their mythic status, ensuring Monaco and its ruling family would never fade into obscurity. What's fascinating is how the Grimaldis turned weakness into strength. Other dynasties crumbled under political pressure or died out from lack of heirs. The Grimaldis, they adapted. They turned their principality into a glittering brand, a place where fortune and folklore intertwined. Walk through Monaco's old town today, and you'll find their palace still perched on the rock, its cannons forever pointed at the sea, a symbolic gesture, perhaps, against the tides of history that nearly swallowed them. Their survival wasn't just luck. It was a mix of cunning, charm, and the occasional desperate gamble. While other noble houses rigidly clung to tradition, the Grimaldis bent, adopting heirs, marrying movie stars, even rewriting the rules when necessary. In the end, they didn't just avoid disappearing, they rewrote the script, proving that sometimes the best way to stay on the throne is to dance on the edge of it. From poisonings to political intrigue, these 25 noble families vanished without a single battle, their stories dissolving into the fog of history like whispers in an empty hall. What chills isn't just how they disappeared, but how easily the world moved on. Castles that once echoed with their laughter became museums. Thrones they carved with their names were claimed by strangers. Even their greatest triumphs were rewritten, their roles reduced to footnotes in someone else's story. Consider the eerie parallels between their fates. The Lusignans snuffed out by suspected poison, their last king dying in agony at a banquet. The Premyslids, their final heir, murdered in a shadowy alley, his killer never found. The Valois, a dynasty that collapsed not under cannon fire, but under the weight of a jousting accident and a monk's dagger. Each disappearance feels like a different verse of the same haunting song. Power, no matter how absolute, is always one generation away from oblivion. Yet their legacies linger in the strangest places. The Bourbons' blood still flows in Europe's royal veins, though their name was stripped of its might. The Plantagenets' laws shape Britain's justice system, even as their castles stand empty. And the Grimaldis, they clung to their cliffside kingdom by turning survival into an art form, proving that sometimes the boldest move a dynasty can make is to adapt before the ground crumbles beneath them. These stories aren't just about kings and queens, they're about us. They remind us that history isn't a tidy ledger of dates and battles, but a web of fragile choices and unseen forces. A single heir's illness, a daughter's unlucky marriage, a king's misjudged trust, any could unravel centuries of planning in a heartbeat. The real mystery isn't how these families vanished, but how any dynasty lasts at all. So which disappearance grips you the most? The Medici's quiet fade into banking obscurity, the Romanovs' brutal erasure in a basement, or perhaps the Savoys voted into exile by the very people they once ruled. Drop your thoughts below, and if these shadows of history left you hungry for more, don't forget to subscribe. After all, the past is full of doors left slightly ajar, waiting for someone like you to push them open and listen to what whispers.